thank you everybody for making the time to join, especially Ashley Ruba, who's leading the talk today. I'm Sarah Gilmore. I'm chair of the SLAC Internship Committee, which is the Science of Learning, Art of Communication program at UConn. And I'm a doctoral student in the Ed Psych department in the Learning Science program. So we're really, really excited to have been able to arrange this event with Ashley, who I'm going to introduce a little bit more in a minute. But I just wanted to do a tiny little bit of housekeeping before we start. There will be time for questions at the end. So if questions occur to you while Ashley's talking, feel free to put them in the chat and I can raise them on your behalf, or you can raise them when we get to the end, or just make a note. If you want to ask your question anonymously, you can send me a direct message and I'll make sure that I can ask it and I won't mention your name. We do have some security protocols in place, so I hope there won't be any Zoom bombing, but if there is an issue, I'll remove them as fast as I can. And if we have to leave the meeting for any reason, just come back into the same link, but I hope that's not going to happen. The meeting is being recorded so that we can share it later, and I'll email out the recording link with everybody on the registration list. It's also going to be hosted on the Slack website, and I'll pop the URL for that in the chat so you can find it later. So, time to get to the good stuff. We are so excited to introduce Dr. Ashley Ruba, who received her PhD in Developmental Psychology from the University of Washington and is now a mixed methods UX researcher developing AR and VR experiences at Meta Reality Labs. I'm sorry. We're really excited to have Dr. Ruba with us today because not only does she have a lot of really valuable experience to share about her journey from academia to industry, but I would also describe her as an advocate for not just normalizing, but championing and celebrating alternatives to academic careers. If you don't follow her on social media yet, I highly recommend that you do, because she brings a much needed, supportive and forward-looking voice to the conversation about what options there are for researchers post-PhD. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Ashley.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Sarah. Like Sarah said, my name is Ashley, and I will be talking to you about my journey moving from academia to my current role working in UX at Meta. And I'm also was really happy to be selected as the inaugural representative for psychology for non-academic careers for HSS. So that was really exciting. And so I will just kind of give you a little brief overview of a little more like about me and how I ended up here. And so I got my bachelor's at Duke back in 2013, and I entered undergrad knowing that I wanted to study psych. Was really interested in getting a PhD in clinical psych, and I actually ended up in a language development lab when I was at Duke. And in that lab, got very fascinated with research and infant development in particular, infant emotion perception in particular. And so kind of towards the end of undergrad, I was like, actually, I don't want to be a clinician. I want to be a researcher, really into research. And so I ended up focusing on developmental psych for my PhD, which I got at the University of Washington in Seattle in 2019. And throughout undergrad and grad school, I was told, you know, you're so amazing, like you would make a wonderful professor, like that's what you should do. And so that was my plan. And so I kind of had just a sole focus on I'm going to be tenure track faculty, R1 or bust, basically, and carried that through basically to the last year of my PhD until I sat on a faculty search committee. And I saw the process from the other side, and I was, you know, as a grad student looking at people, like we had 150 people apply for one job, and I was looking at resumes or like CVs of people who were like much better than my CV at the time, and just thinking like, how can I possibly get a faculty job? People were getting cut for arbitrary reasons, and it seemed like it wasn't going to happen for me. So at that point, I actually, being in Seattle, knew a few people who had moved into UX research and talked to them, and wasn't sure if like that's really what I wanted to do. So I applied to a single postdoctoral fellowship, thinking there's absolutely no chance that I'm like going to get this fellowship. And then I did. And it was an NIH T32. It was pretty prestigious. And so I, again, was kind of told like, you're amazing, like you can definitely become a professor. And so I took it, and I moved to Wisconsin. And I never lived in the Midwest before. And I moved there right before COVID happened at the end of 2019. And you can imagine what happened next. The pandemic completely decimated all of my research plans, decimated the academic job market. And then I was coming to the end of 2021, third year of my postdoc. I hadn't gone one cycle in the academic job market. Nothing had happened. And I was like, am I going to be a postdoc for a fourth year or a fifth year? Like, how long am I going to keep doing this? And I decided I didn't want to do it anymore. So it was about a year ago. It was last January when I was like, okay, I'm gonna try something else. And I'll tell you a little bit more about like my process and like how I ended up where I am now. But I basically took the first job offer that I got, which was a UXR job offer at a small consulting firm called Bold Insight. And I started there last May and was there for about 4 months. And then I ended up moving to Meta, I've been at Meta since the end of September. So still pretty new to UX, and like salt. So take all of my advice with a grain of salt, but that's the general like trajectory of like how I ended up where I'm at now. And so today I'll talk a little bit more about this decision point and like why I decided to like quote unquote leave academia, and some questions I asked myself and some questions that I think are important that everyone kind of asks themselves and weigh when they're, making these career decisions. I'll talk a little bit about how I ended up exploring careers and some advice that I would give to you if you're also interested in exploring different kinds of careers. And then some more practical advice about how do you even apply for jobs outside of academia. So this question gets thrown around a lot, like, do I want to stay in academia or do I like want to go into industry? And it's not for me, like sometimes it's not a choice, right? Sometimes you've applied to faculty jobs multiple years and nothing has materialized, and it's not you, because at the end of the day, you have hundreds of qualified PhDs applying for very, very few positions, and it's just a numbers game, and they're just like, there aren't enough jobs at the end of the day. So sometimes it's not really a choice, and there are other things where and I will talk about this in a minute, that can kind of push you out of academia a little bit. Like for me, my mental health was really suffering in academia, and I felt like for my own safety and like health, I couldn't stay in this field anymore. So that was also something that swayed my decision to leave. But I feel like this whole idea of like leaving academia, it sounds very dramatic. And at the end of the day, you're just making a career transition, and people make career transitions all the time. And so I just maybe want to plug like moving away from this language a little bit, at least internally. I know that this is the language that people use. But instead, here's some better questions to ask yourself. The first is, where do you want to live, or where do you not want to live? And this was a really big thing that I was considering when I was deciding, whether I wanted to stay on the academic track, like keep trying to be a professor or not. There were just fewer and fewer places in the United States that I actually wanted to live as a queer person who can become pregnant. I just was feeling very unsafe in a lot of different places. And ultimately, that's how I ended up moving back to Seattle, which is where I did my PhD, because I felt really safe here. I had a lot of friends here, and I was able to make that choice because I decided not to pursue an academic career. If I was really wanting to be at an R1, there's only one R1 here in Seattle, and I did my PhD there, and getting a faculty job there was probably not going to happen at all for me. So that is a question, and if you decide that you don't want to pursue an academic career, the number of places that you can live opens up exponentially. So you can live in any city you want. You can take remote work, which has been very popular these days. I have a hybrid job, but my first job was completely remote, so you can truly work anywhere. And that's, one of the nice things that's happened during COVID is we just have so much more flexibility on where we can live. So that was a really big factor for me when I was kind of weighing these career decisions. Another one was money, which I know that we don't really like talking about money in general or in academia specifically, but it is important because, maybe you want to do things with your life, like have kids or buy a house. Maybe you have student loans that you need to pay off. Maybe you have family that you need to take care of. And so, and this is the thing, is that academic jobs are underpaid compared to what you could make doing the work that you do with a PhD. So for example, I was making 50 grand a year as a postdoc, which is, kind of the NIH going rate that postdocs are paid, and I'm making 160 right now as a UX researcher at Meta. And that's actually, I'm not full-time, so I don't actually have like any of the benefits that would come with a full-time position. And so once I'm actually full-time at Meta, like I can easily see myself making over 200 grand a year. So I had no idea that that is how much more money I could make by switching careers. And that's a lot of money. Like that's going to enable me to buy a house in Seattle, which is something I wanted to do when I was a very poor grad student in Seattle and something I never thought I would be able to do. So, these are conversations that you just have to think about. Like there is a really big salary difference between staying in academia and taking a career elsewhere, especially if you move to a big tech company like I did. Another thing that I really considered was leisure time and work-life balance. And so I was actually someone who had really strict work-life boundaries when I was a grad student and a postdoc. I didn't work nights. I didn't work weekends unless I was working on my dissertation, because I didn't want to work all the time. But I always felt so much guilt for not working more. And I had a lot of friends who they're like, "Oh, I took one night off this week," and they just were working all of the time. And there's just an endless to-do list. There's so much pressure to like always do more. And I felt all of this guilt. And then once I actually pivoted away from academia and went into a standard 9 to 5 job, I don't feel that anymore. Like my work day ends and I go and I do something else and I don't think about work, and no one at work is bothering me. No one's expecting me to work on the weekends. And I actually can do all of the work that I have within a 40-hour work week. And so just having that pressure lift off, I didn't expect that that would impact me as much as it did, but it really did alleviate a lot of the anxiety I felt about not being productive enough. Another thing, and Sarah and I were just talking about this, is to think about what aspects of academia you enjoy or don't enjoy. For me, I did not like teaching. I didn't like curriculum development. I didn't like prepping lectures. I didn't like grading papers. And it's just really funny because I look back and every advisor I had was like, well, you can just buy out of your teaching requirements with grant money. Like, just be a professor and like you won't actually have to teach. You can just get grants and buy out. And no one actually suggested to me that maybe I could just go and do a pure research career and not actually have to do any of this curriculum development. So if you're like me and you don't like teaching, or maybe you hate grant writing, maybe you don't like writing papers, maybe you actually don't like research that much. Like there are other jobs, there's so many other jobs out there where you can just focus on the one thing that you really like and not have to do any of the other things that you don't like. So that's another thing to consider, and an important question when you're, kind of diving in this wild world of like, well, what am I going to do if I'm not in academia? This is the first question you need to ask yourself: is what do you actually like doing? And then from there, you can kind of narrow down on different careers. And I mentioned this before, but my mental health was ultimately something that really pushed me out of academia. I've struggled with depression, anxiety for my entire adult life, and it got really, really bad when I was in grad school, and it continued to just get worse and worse as I progressed through my academic career. Just this constant worrying, and it got really bad when I was on the academic job market, this constant worrying of like, checking the psych jobs wiki and I'm like, are the interviews out? And like, am I good enough? Is my CV good enough? And like, just always wondering like if what I was doing was enough, and because it never felt like enough. And I'm someone I published 15 first author papers. I have 2 dissertation awards. Like I had a 3-year NIH postdoctoral fellowship. Like by all metrics, I was like doing really well, and I still felt like it wasn't enough. And so that was ultimately something that ended up like having me pivot. And now I feel actually like the team that I work on, I feel like they actually value me and they actually see that I get like a lot of praise in my work, which I don't feel like is something I really got in academia, because it can be really critical when you're getting peer reviews and all kinds of reviews and rejections over and over again. So that was something that ultimately like played a role in me deciding that this wasn't going to work out for me, this particular career. There are no right or wrong answers. If you've considered all these things and you're like, I still want to like go for it and go for academia, I'm like all for it. But I think these are questions that I didn't really fully consider when I was a grad student, and I wish that I would have like actually sat down and really thought about what I wanted rather than kind of just like listening to what other people were telling me that I should do. Okay. And so now I'm going to talk about, so if you're at least intrigued, and I think truly because of the state of the academic job market, if you're not at least considering non-academic jobs, you're probably doing yourself a disservice because statistically, you're not going to get a faculty job. That's just how it is. And so you really need to at least just like consider like just a little bit like what else is out there. But it's like you have no idea, right? Like I didn't know what else was out there. And so I'm just going to go through like a few job titles of jobs that I applied for and was considering when I was making this move. So the first job is obviously UX and UXR, and I'll talk in more detail in a minute about what I do. The second is market research, and so this is another research-focused career that and I have friends who were also psych PhDs who ended up going into market research. It's a little more survey-based, so if you really like survey design, this could be a good career for you. Data science is another career option if you're kind of more into programming. So if you really like, I have friends who work in both R and Python, but if you really like building data pipelines and working and manipulating with data and maybe even doing machine learning, like being a data scientist could be a fun career option. All of my friends who are data scientists love their jobs. For social scientists, there's like behavioral and people scientist roles, and that I think they tend to kind of recruit PhDs more specifically who actually have training in the social sciences. But you are doing research for companies on different things, and so that's also another research-focused option. And then there are research scientist positions everywhere, in all kinds of fields, and so that's also, you know, a career option that I considered as well. Sorry, I'm just getting over a cold, but hopefully we'll get through this talk. You can, there's also project management as well. And so if you really are more into like the project management side of things, like that could be a good career option too. If you like grant writing, there's the grant writing positions at various places. There's also medical writing if you like writing as well. And I know people who have moved into that career. If you want to stay in more like an academic adjacent field, you can go work for journals or academic societies and different avenues like that. And then there's also a bunch of jobs that you can have in like policy and government work as well. So this is just like a smattering of different careers that you can consider, and I'll talk a little bit more later, but LinkedIn is a really great place where you can network with people and figure out, you know, based on your interests, like what kinds of careers people have got into as well. But I'll talk a little bit about UX research because that's what I do. And so if you haven't heard about UX, because it seems like people either have heard about it and it has a reputation, or people have never heard about it. So as a UX researcher, I study people to help inform product design. And so the term UX was actually, it's been around for a really long time. So UXR was actually, the field was actually started by someone who worked at Apple in the early 90s. And if you've ever used an iPhone or any kind of Apple product, you know that they're really easy to use. And that's because there's just been hours and upon hours of research that have gone into the design of these products to make it so there's something that people want. There's something that are really intuitive to use as well. I'm an Apple person, so I really like Apple products for that reason. So yeah, so that's kind of like the general idea of like what UX is, but you don't have to just work in tech. So at the first company I worked at, it was a consulting company called Bold Insight. And we actually had contracts with all of these different companies. And so you can see some of them are, I worked with automotive companies or pharmaceutical companies, tech companies, food and beverage companies. So there's all different kinds of products and services that you could actually conduct UXR on. And it was at this first company that I was at where I realized that I really liked working in tech. We had a contract with a big tech company, and then that's how I ended up at Meta. And so I kind of realized I had taken this first job, which was like an entry-level UXR job, and I really wanted more responsibility to manage projects. And so I ended up applying to Meta kind of on a whim. And then I ended up getting this job in Reality Labs, which is essentially Oculus. And so this is some of the stuff that we're working on right now. So there's obviously like the Quest and the Meta Quest, which are like the VR systems, but I work in the like R&D side of Reality Labs, and so everything that we're working on is still at least 5 years out from being a consumer product. So it's a pretty like academic setting, which I really like and I think is pretty cool. And so these are some of the things that we're working on. So a lot of the work I do is on augmented reality glasses, but we're also working on, other kinds of wearables like gloves or wristbands that are going to essentially inform the next wave of computing. So, what is the next iPhone basically? Like what is the next piece of tech that people don't have right now, but in, 10 or 15 years is going to be like really widely adopted. That's what I'm working on right now and trying to figure out in these really early stages what are things that people might want or need. So it's like pretty like evaluative work, which I don't know. I've really liked everything that I've done so far at Meta. Um, and then in terms of, being a UX researcher, it's like, what do you do? Like, what do you actually, what kind of skills do you need? So Nielsen and Norman Group is a resource that I would check out. And I think it was either Nielsen or Norman who was the first like UX researcher at Apple. So this website has a lot of great resources on it as well. But in terms of skills that you need to have, and these are all skills that you actually develop during a PhD program. Research obviously is like the big skill, and particularly like qualitative research. Most UXR jobs are more qualitative in focus, so you're doing more like interviews and observations. But I'm a mixed methods person, so I will dip into more like survey work as well, in addition to having more like quant focused studies that like maybe you have some sort of metrics that come out from the studies that you're doing that you need to analyze because it's a quant study. So so you have like qualitative, there's some mixed methods, and then there are more quant focused positions that are coming out, and that is a little more survey and like metrics based. And so you'll want to look at the job ads and kind of figure out like based on your experience and your interests, where do you fall? For the quant positions, they are typically looking for someone who has a stats background and also knows programming. So I could have applied for quant. I could have applied for any of these positions. I kind of like being mixed methods because I think it's like the best of both worlds. But I didn't realize that there were these differences when I first started moving into UX. Writing is another really big skill. And so instead of writing 30-page papers, which I actually really did like doing when I was an academic, because I wrote a lot of them, instead we write reports and like PowerPoint presentations. But being able to communicate your research findings very concisely is a really important skill because no one is going to read a 30-page paper outside of academia. It's just not going to happen. So you need to be able to communicate your findings super succinctly. And so writing is a really big skill that you'll need to do that. Public speaking is also a huge skill that you'll need. And so a lot of my job is basically taking my findings and talking about them to people who are not researchers. So I'm working with designers and I'm working with engineers who are actually working on these products and like working on the design of the products and kind of like truly like the engineering that's going into this hardware. And they're coming to me with things that they want to test with people. And then I'm going back to them after I do this research and explaining to them, this is what I found. And so being able to communicate with, designers who they're not researchers. Like I have to explain stats often to people, which is not something I had to do as an academic. But being able to talk about your work to people who are not from the same field as you and aren't, they're not academics, they're not PhDs. It's a really important skill. And I think going along with that is just this storytelling ability and we have that a little bit when we're writing papers and stuff, but being able to really like sell a story and sell an idea based on the data that you have is really important too. And then in terms of regular activities, so like what I do in my day-to-day life, it's actually pretty similar to what I did as a postdoc. I mean, I say that being like a COVID postdoc, but also pretty similar to like my last few years of grad school where I was really just like drilling down into my dissertation and doing like focusing more on research full time. So a lot of the stuff I do is qualitative research. I'm usability studies, like if you've heard of this method, it's basically just giving a prototype of a product that you have to people and asking them to do different tasks. For me, because I'm in this R&D department, we actually sometimes don't have working prototypes. We're trying to do like really early work figuring out, what my people want. So in like the AR glasses space, for example, one of the last studies I did, we were testing I can't talk about like the specifics of my research, but we were testing whether people wanted a particular feature, but we weren't actually able, the tech didn't exist to make this feature real yet. So instead we were simulating what this feature might look like in virtual reality. So it's like put on the VR headset, imagine that you're wearing AR glasses, and like this is what you might see, for example. And so that's the way that we can get around that, at least like in my department specifically. And then interviews is a big part of that. So when you're actually, doing this work with people, you might ask people, how do you feel about this particular feature? Asking them to do different tasks, and then you're getting all of this really rich qualitative data out of that. And you'll have to do thematic analysis or pull out things that people have said. And then those are your findings. And I come from, my background in my PhD was like very quant heavy. So I've only did like one qualitative study before. So if you don't have any qualitative research experience, it's definitely something that you can consider getting while you're still a PhD student for sure. I don't actually do many field studies, but that is sometimes like more common in certain companies where you might actually take whatever product you have and go and see how people use it in their everyday lives. You might go into people's homes, or you might go into like, I used to do some work on medical devices, and so we'd actually go into hospitals and see how doctors would actually use these devices in the field. And so there's a lot of different places that you can do studies. So you can also do them. We have like lab spaces here since, like essentially work at Oculus. So we have like Oculus lab spaces in Seattle, and then we also do some remote studies as well. And then surveys is actually not something that I do super often, but for some UX roles, surveys are really, really common. I think of surveys as more of like a marketing research tool. I think for UX, the way I see it is it's a little more focused on people's behaviors as opposed to their attitudes about things. So if you like have measures of, it's better to ask to like observe how people are using a product than to ask them how they might see themselves using the product, because what people think they'll do is not actually what they actually do when they have something in front of them. So usually better to rely more heavily on behavior than like attitudinal measures in UX. In terms of desired skill, and I think the confusion that I see some of the time with people who are transitioning to UX is visual design. So I am not a designer. I don't use Figma. I don't like actually do any of the designs myself. And that's because at Meta, the roles of UX researcher and UX designer are two separate different roles. At smaller companies, the designers tend to be the ones doing the research on their own designs. So I think having some eye for visual design is nice, but you definitely don't need to have the level of design ability as a designer, for example. And then in terms of the background, most UX researchers actually don't have a graduate degree. It's usually just an undergrad degree, and it's in the social sciences. So it's like sociology, anthropology, political science. And so any field that studies human behavior is like the background for UX research. There are master's programs that have popped up lately in human factors or like human and computer interaction. And so I think people who are like really serious about UX research as undergrads will go into those master's programs. And I have friends who like went into master's programs to go into UX. But I think having a PhD, like it gives you all of these skills. The big things that I see missing from people who want to transition to UX, and the things that I was missing, are just like knowledge about business and knowledge about product development. But these are things that you can teach yourself. And so I tell PhDs this all the time, like you're expert learners, like you can teach yourself anything. Like all of this is like very learnable. But those are the two big areas that I see PhDs. Like I didn't know anything about product development when I moved into UX. Like I didn't know anything about business and like the financial decisions that businesses have to make and things like that. But these are things that I think about all the time now as a UX researcher. And this is also kind of like a graph just to illustrate like how much the field has grown in terms of like UXR people and like UX people in general, because as you can imagine, actually doing research on what people want in a product makes products perform better. So companies are recognizing that having UX researchers on their team is really important. So there has been a lot of hiring lately. This hiring has slowed a bit, and then it's definitely gotten a little bit weird because of all of the mass layoffs that have happened in tech recently. So in terms of breaking into the field, it is a little bit difficult, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. But I would just say like do your research, and I'll talk about this now in terms of like how to research different careers. And if at the end of the day, if you decide like, I looked into all these different careers, like UXR is like the one that really interests me the most, like I'm really going to go for it, like do that. But I think you have to be aware like the hiring landscape right now is weird because of the looming recession, because of all of the layoffs, because the market is saturated with people who were laid off from these big tech companies. And so I'm going to plug some of my favorite resources that I used when I was applying for jobs. Beyond the Professor, it's my favorite. And I always recommend this podcast. It's called Job Search the Smart Way. And basically everything I know and like tell people about applying and finding non-academic jobs is in this podcast. It's probably like 15 hours of content. So it's not that long, but it's really like, this was the resource that I used when I was a grad student, when I felt like there was nothing out there in the world to tell me like how can I look for other jobs. Like I can't recommend them enough. And so I would also, if you're on Twitter, and like I'm on Twitter, I like recently moved into LinkedIn. I like LinkedIn better than Twitter now, which I never thought I would actually say out loud. But on Twitter, there is a group that I started with a couple of people called All Tech Chats. And so if you like go to the group or like go to the hashtag, there's so many resources that we've shared over the past year of kind of like talking about our transition out of academia. All of us kind of like ran into each other on academic Twitter of around the same time about a year ago, because we were all making the same career transition at the same time and felt super isolated. So that's why we started this group, to share resources with people. If you're looking for a book, Chris Catterin has this lovely book that I think really kind of gave me some of the courage that I needed to leave academia, and talks about his own transition and kind of and I talk about this too on social media, just like the grief and the fear and the doubt and like all of these negative emotions that you have when you're like, you feel like you're abandoning everything, and you're like abandoning your research career, and you're a failure, and you're a sellout, and all of these things. I think he lays it out really beautifully in this book. And I had heard a podcast interview of him, and that I feel like that interview was the thing that really like flipped the switch in my brain and told me like, okay, this is like, it's okay. Like we're gonna be fine. Like this is totally fine. I can do this. And if you're looking at UXR resources in particular, I'd recommend Darren Hood. He has a podcast that I'm currently, so much content there. I'm currently like working through the backlogs of it now, but he recently did like a 15-parter on the UX job market, which I think is really, really invaluable to hear his perspective as someone who's been in the field for over 20 years. Lots of great information in there about like breaking into UX and teaching yourself, and qualities that you need to have to be a UX researcher and things like that. And then he has a blog where he has like all these book recommendations, and the one in the top left, Think Like a UX Researcher, I've read and I really like. And again, I think the thing about UX is like UXR is not academic research. They're like quite different. The pace of UX research is much faster. The way that you have to think about product development and impact of your research is very different than academic research. And so if you want to move into UX research, you really need to immerse yourself in like what is this field and like what is the language and what are the methods and all of this stuff. Like there is a lot that you need to teach yourself, but you can teach yourself. And so you have to do that work. You can't just like decide to move into UX and then like move into UX. Like it's a process. So if that is the choice that you've made, like these are the resources that I use to help myself make that career transition, and those same ones that you can use as well. LinkedIn. I was a LinkedIn hater until like a month ago. And then I feel like Twitter started becoming a really weird place. And then I started posting like all of the content I typically post on Twitter, on LinkedIn, and the response has been completely like unbelievable. I feel like I didn't appreciate how valuable LinkedIn is. And so if you don't have a LinkedIn and you're a grad, if you're like at any stage and you're considering moving out of academia, like you should make a LinkedIn. And then you can follow me like for sure, and then send me a connection request if you want to connect. And you can write a message in your request saying that you saw my talk, because I've been getting hundreds of connection requests, and so I have to filter them a little bit. But if you tell me that you were here, like I'm happy to like formally connect with you on LinkedIn. And then if you're like, I don't even know what to put on my LinkedIn profile, I would look at mine. Mine is completely filled out. This is like a sample of how I described my academic research experience. So the University of Washington is like all of my graduate school experience. Wisconsin is my postdoc. And so you can see here like how I framed my research experience. And so this is a way where you can start thinking about your own research experience, and you can go through some of my. I've only been posting content there for like a month, so I don't have like. I do have posts there, and there's one on resume writing that seemed pretty popular, and so I think like a lot of the advice I have about how to frame your academic research experience can be found in that particular post. You can also go to my website and see the current version, my current resume. And then also under the resources tab, I have the resume that I use to apply to UXR jobs, which I think has more of my academic research experience on it. So I think that's also a way that you can start to see like how do people even frame their academic experiences when they're looking for other kinds of jobs. And so kind of like the formula here is you want to focus on outcomes. So you want to say you accomplished X by doing Y as measured by Z. So trying to quantify your experience as much as possible is important. I see PhDs, and this I like talked about this in my post about resumes. Like no one probably cares what you studied. Like as an academic, like I studied babies. Meta doesn't care that I studied babies. Like it's whatever. But they do care that I have really good research skills, I have really great writing skills, I have great public speaking skills. Like all of these skills that I have is what they care about. So, and this is why I'd also recommend listening to the Beyond the Professoriate podcast, because they talk about this a lot too, is I think academics tend to focus too much on their subject matter expertise and like talking about their specific research findings and getting really in the weeds, but it like that doesn't matter. Like what matters is the skills that you have. And if you can identify like for this particular career, like these are the skills that I need and this is how I can illustrate that I have these skills, that's how you end up moving into another career. And you have skills, you have transferable skills. Don't let anyone tell you that you don't have transferable skills, because you absolutely do. Okay, so just kind of to sum up my best advice moving forward. So I would definitely get on LinkedIn. Like I said, follow me, connect with me. I'm posting resources and content all the time about academia and things like that. And if you have like specific questions for me, I'm happy to message with you, or even I feel like I get a lot of ideas for posts by people asking me questions over message. So you can contact me there. I'd also recommend conducting informational interviews, and this is actually things that I've been posting about this week, is just how to do that. And so when you're in this exploration stage of trying to figure out, like what job do you want to connect with people who have jobs that interest you and see like, hey, can we like have a chat for like 20-30 minutes, and I just want to ask you some questions about your career. And you're trying to gather information to make a judgment about what career based on your interests you think would be the best fit for you. And so you can I would definitely recommend like building your network, doing informational interviews. And then once you've kind of gone through this information gathering stage, really just focus on one job. And this was the mistake that I made was I applied to like everything and I didn't really network and I didn't really have referrals. And it worked out for me. I do not recommend this job search strategy to people. It was like not optimal. And I think especially if you want to move into UXR, like it's such a specific discipline where most people don't have PhDs that I think it just requires some extra effort and framing of all of your experience. And I think for me, like applying to research scientist positions and UXR positions, like my like initial resume was so unfocused. Like I could see why I wasn't actually like getting that much movement in like UXR interviews now that I go back and I look at it. Like I said, teach yourself. You can learn anything if it's about UXR, like absolutely go teach yourself. I'd recommend workshopping your resume with people. Like I said, you can ask for people's resumes so you can see how people frame their academic research experience. Try to get eyes. Other people can take a look at it. There is a PhD to UXR Facebook group that I haven't been like super involved in, but I am aware that it exists, and there is some like resume sharing and workshopping there if you're interested in that particular career. If you're a grad student, please do an internship. I did not do one when I was a grad student. Definitely like regret it. I had the opportunity to do an internship at Oculus when I was a grad student and I said no, which is very funny now given that I like work at Oculus essentially. But I know multiple people who like had an internship in grad school and then that converted to a full-time role after they graduated. So it's definitely like worth doing because that gives you the one thing that you're probably missing for UXR jobs in particular, and that's experience. So if you have time in your PhD to do an internship, I'd like that is the one thing I'd recommend doing. And just know what you're worth, which is really hard because I feel like at least me leaving academia, I felt like, you know, who cares about me? Like all I am good for is academia. But the thing is, like, you're a highly qualified and skilled researcher, and there's so many other careers that you can have. And so just like understanding that, you can get paid a lot of money for your skills outside of academia is also just an important thing to keep in mind when you're negotiating salary and things like that. Um, Oh, that's an old picture of me. So you can connect with me all these places. Like I said, I think LinkedIn is probably like the most reliable place, but you can send me an email. Email's probably better. Email first, but definitely connect with me on LinkedIn. And then I'm becoming less active on Twitter, but I also have a lot of good stuff on my website. And I am happy to take any questions. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Ashley.
Yeah.
That's awesome. We have a couple of questions in the chat. If anyone also has questions, they're happy to shout out. Maybe if you want to like put up a hand emoji or something so that we can kind of keep it organized. But I'll start with one from the chat to kind of get people going. Does your role involve coordination with other departments, for example, like the tech team to optimize the prototype? And have you seen any challenges in communicating with teams that might be more tech oriented but less caring about the human factor side?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I guess like the way that Reality Labs is structured. So this is going to be different at different companies, but there's like different pillars. So there's like the audio team and the displays team and the haptics team. And so I am like working with all these different teams. And so I think this is like a new thing because the org has become much bigger. That there used to be not a lot of crosstalk between these pillars. And so I am trying to like bridge them a bit more. And then the second part of the question, can you remind me? I had it in my head.
Have you seen any challenges in communicating with teams that might be more thinking about the tech and less about the kind of humans using the tech?
Yeah, a little bit. I think this has to do, and we're talking about this. This has to do with like the UX maturity of the company. So there's companies, and you would think that like Meta would be like pretty mature in their UX, but it is a little. We are dealing with these things like we are building augmented reality glasses. Like it is happening whether people want them or not. Like this is just a thing that's happening. And I don't know if any of you remember Google Glass from like 10 years ago, but like we could like this could happen. Like we could have Google Glass like round two for very similar reasons. And so I think like they're like Meta definitely cares about like the human experience in UX, but at the same time, like have we done enough like foundational research to know if people actually want the tech that we're building? Like I don't think so. Um, so these are definitely conversations we're having at the beginning of the year where we're trying to set our research priorities for the rest of the year and thinking about like what is the most foundational, impactful work that we can do with the limited resources that we have.
Amanda?
Hi. So first of all, thank you so much for your talk. A lot of it resonated with me and I just think it was awesome and it speaks on behalf of a lot of non-traditional students. Um, so I wanted to ask what the most discouraging part of the job search was for you, and how long did it take before you found your position where you're happy?
Um, yeah, that's a good question. So I, the most discouraging part of my job search, there were two moments that stood out. The first was I had a job offer as a research scientist for like a small, um, I guess it was like technically a nonprofit, but the salary was actually like pretty good for a nonprofit doing research that was very, very similar to what I had done in academia. And so I had the job offer and I went to negotiate the salary and they rescinded the offer. So that was really painful because I was like, I'm going to take this job and I'm going to like keep doing my like academic adjacent research. And then all of a sudden it was just gone. And then something like somewhat similar happened with another job where I made it into I had done like a bunch of take home assignments, like poured probably like 20 hours into this interview process, made it to the final loop, and then they just cut the position and then it was over. So those were definitely like discouraging parts. At the end of the day, like my first job offer I got within 2 months of starting to apply. That's definitely fast, but I think like they had a particularly like fast job search process. I usually tell people to give themselves like 6 months. And that kind of depends on like how much time do you have to devote to applying for jobs. Are you trying to write your dissertation at the same time? Or like do you have like all day to devote to like networking and applying for jobs and all of this? So yeah, it really depends. But I think I did get lucky in that I got an offer in a couple of months from at least from like one company.
I'll go back to the chat for one, and then David. What experiences do you think help you enter the field of UXR? Any other advice for PhD job candidates to stand out in the job search for UXR?
Yeah, I think like I said, internships while you're a grad student is like the most important thing that you can do. I think like in terms of there's this question about like standing out, but I think it's more like, do you have the skills? Like, have you taught yourself about UX? Like, do you know what UX is? And I say this as someone who I think like moved into UX like not really knowing that much about it. I had it my first job was like a true entry level position. I did teach myself enough to like get through the interview process, but the bar wasn't like super high for like like at Meta, for instance, like I could not have gotten this job as like my first job. I like wouldn't have made it through the interview. The interview was like pretty grueling. Um, and so I think you just have to teach yourself, you just have to like immerse yourself in UX and like the language and the methods and that as much as you can. And then once you like if you do truly start to understand like what UX is and like the research and all of that, like that will come through in your resumes and in your interviews. And that's what will ultimately make you stand out is the fact that you sound like a UX researcher.
David, why don't you go ahead? Uh, we can't hear you, David.
Was muted. You'd think I know how to do this by now. Yeah, hi. I am in the last year of my PhD, hopefully, and looking to transition into data science. Just kind of fits my skills better.
Yeah.
I'm curious what your feelings are about the future of remote work. I know a lot of like C-suite companies, I mean, C-suite people at companies are really sort of starting to sort of lash out about it. And I know tech companies tend to be better, but as someone who wants to get into data science, tech companies are kind of like the not the entry level jobs generally. Like places like Meta
Yeah.
are looking for the best of the best. So I'm curious if you have from people you know or just from Meta itself, if you have a feeling on what that future is looking like.
Yeah, I think at least like at least like at Meta, I know that in Seattle, they're like ending their leases on a few of the buildings here because people just like aren't coming into the offices, and so that's the way that they're saving money is by like ending the leases on these buildings and having like allowing people to work from home more. I think obviously like you see the backlash from companies where they're like you have to come back into the office, and then people are just like quitting, right? And they're going to other companies. Um, so yeah, I think I'm someone who doesn't like working like I'm actually like I'm at one of the Meta offices right now. Like I actually don't like working from home. I like to have that separation between like I'm at home and I'm at work. Um, but yeah, I think remote work will continue to be a thing. And I think it's probably going to depend like company by company, like how they want to do it. But I think like workers will vote with their feet ultimately if they really don't want to go back into the office. Like they'll leave, they'll go somewhere else.
Another couple from the chat here. The first one is, where did it go? Here it is. Which quant courses, aside from the foundational ones, do you think might be particularly valuable for more quantitative work in UX?
Yeah, so I think like quant UX isn't quite at the level of like a data scientist, but I think knowing how to do more complicated like multivariate like more complicated modeling or k-means cluster analyses, like those are methods that I think like quant UXRs tend to use a bit more. Um, so like any courses like that, but I don't think you don't need to know like machine learning, for example. I think that's definitely more of like a data science technique. But I think knowing how to program and like do stats in a programming language is going to be like a requirement for like a quant UXR position. So R or Python is typically what you need to learn.
Another one, do you see anyone move from industry back to academic research? Is it significantly more difficult to transition later in one's career?
Um, yeah, I feel like my graduate advisor said something to me along these lines. She's like, well, if you leave, like you can never come back. I'm just like, for me, that's fine. I have met very, very few people who like regretted leaving. And so I think like I wouldn't go back. Like I don't want to go back. And I think like I'm aware of people who like went back, but I don't think that it's very common. And especially if you're I think like in reality labs, like we have like research partnerships with universities, and so that's definitely like I still keep and I'm going to I don't know if anyone here is going to SRCD. Like I'm going to SRCD in March to like present some of my to be able to discuss it in a symposium with some of my friends. Like I'm still tied to the academic world a little bit, um but yeah, I think in terms of like being like leaving and then coming back to be a professor, I think that's gonna be hard. Not impossible. I've like heard of people doing it, but it's not very common.
And I think the second part of the question then will come to Louisa was, do you think is it harder to transition to UXR later in your career? Is this something you just do like right out of your PhD, or can you do it whenever?
Yeah. You can do it whenever. Like I've done it. I know tenured faculty who have done it. It is so much easier to do it while you're a grad student. Like so much more easier because someone told me this when I was in my last year of my PhD. I didn't listen to them and I took a postdoc. Don't do a post if you like want to go. If you like don't want to be an academic, like don't do a postdoc. Like just don't do it. You're in a completely different applicant pool when you're like a student versus now you're not a student. Now you're like post PhD and you're expected to have, like real world work experience, and a postdoc, an academic postdoc does not count. It counts as research experience, but it doesn't count as like industry experience, it's academic research experience. So if you're like any doubts about like leaving, just do it after your PhD. Like don't do a postdoc. Is my take.
Lisa?
Hello. So one of the questions I have is I'm also from a very creative field. I'm from digital media. I'm doing an MFA and it's my second master's already. Uh just a question, I don't know if I missed in the beginning, but like was it like leadership a skill that you thought that was very negotiable as someone that was just in the academia this whole time? Because I do feel for jobs now in the future, like using the aspect that in the academia, I do feel we need a lot of leadership skills. So I don't know if it makes sense. Does it make sense to you?
Yeah. So I think so like when you like first transition into like any non-academic research track, you're probably going to be like an individual contributor. So that's like what track you can go on, where you are like a researcher and you're doing research projects. And then after a while of like being an individual contributor and like getting promoted, then you can go on to the management track. And that's where the leadership skills come in. So like I'm like a I'm like a level 4 at Meta. And these are like equivalent to like software engineering levels. And then I think once you get up to like a level 6, then you can move into management. And then at that point, you can manage a team and you have people who are directly reporting to you. And I think you can stay an individual contributor forever. Like you never have to go into management at all. I think I probably leading a team sounds fun. Like I wanted my own lab for a really long time. So I think I will end up going in that direction after a few years if that seems like something I still want to do. But I think at least in the beginning, you don't really need like team leadership skills. You do need to be able to lead projects and be able to, have an opinion about like, this is how we're going to design this project, or like, this is the project that we're going to do. And like that kind of leadership, like you'll need, but you don't need to be like managing people necessarily right off the bat. That's definitely something that you can do later on.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Another question that came up in a session yesterday was the question of whether or not it's possible to still advance the causes that you care about while being in industry. So this sense that if we leave academia, we're kind of leaving behind our communities that we care about in our research. And like you had mentioned earlier, this idea of selling out. Can you help people?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It also depends on like what are you interested in like helping out. Like I mean I never expected to have like a social media platform that like I have like 25,000 followers on Twitter and like 15,000 followers on LinkedIn. And I'm like creating content and helping people, and people message me every day and tell me like how much I've helped them. And so like, and this has nothing to do with like my job. So there's like so many other avenues that you can explore. Like you can go out and volunteer in the real world. Like you can donate your money to causes that you care about. Like there's so many ways that you can make an impact that like isn't directly related to your work. And I think as academics, we tend to make work our entire identity and like want to get everything out of our job. But there's so many of course like you could make a difference in like your specific career, but you can also do all of these other things outside of your job because now you have the time and the money to do these things. But I will say, like in my job, like we are thinking about accessibility, for example, and that's, something we're thinking about when we're designing products in terms of, some of the AR glasses, like a feature that we're working on has to do with augmented hearing, which would obviously benefit people who have difficulty hearing, or people who have difficulty seeing. And so these are things that we're thinking about when we're designing this tech as well. So there's definitely like, you can go into accessibility, like UXR specifically, for example. And there's like tons of ways that you can make a difference, both like in your career and then not in your 9 to 5.
We got a couple more in the chat, and then anyone else wants to jump in. I wonder, what is the work culture and hours like in UXR?
Yeah, I think it depends company to company. I like Amazon, I hear, and I've had friends who work there. notoriously like churn and burn work culture. Like they will grind you into the ground. I don't know that I want to work at Amazon, but at least like the culture at Meta is like everyone's really chill. And I, no one's like necessarily keeping tabs on me as long as I'm getting my work done. There's no like I like go into the office like if I want to, or I can work at home if I want to. And yeah, I think it's like a pretty relaxed culture. I think everyone mostly just like everyone's like really approachable and friendly. And I think there's definitely teams where I think if you're on more of like a product team and you have like we are launching this product in May, like we have to get this work done now. I think there's like more pressure. But it's really going to depend on like what team you're on and what company you're at, and like how intense the work culture is. Yeah, that's like my here it's great. Other places like I don't know. Like I said, Amazon is notoriously bad.
All right, last question I have from the chat is, so what would be the kind of requirements for quant if you were to be a mixed method UX researcher, sort of building on the more kind of quant specific questions? Coming from a qual background, what is your kind of bare minimum that you need?
Like if you were to be a mixed methods person? Is that sorry?
Yeah, I think if you were to go into mixed methods, or can you do purely qualitative UX research?
Oh yeah. No, I mean at my first company, I was one of like 2 people who knew how to do stats in R, like out of 100 people. Like we didn't like most of our work was like interviews and observations. Like we weren't like running stats on anything. So you can definitely go into like pure qualitative like UXR. Like that's what most UXR is. And so in terms of like the stuff that I do like mixed methods is I really like mixing in like some survey data into the more qualitative like interviews and observations that we have. So being able to analyze that data is useful. And I mean I taught myself R because I wanted to use ggplot mostly, but it's a really nice like data cleaning tool as well. And but I think like my manager, for example, like does everything in Excel, like does data clean in Excel and will run like t-tests in Excel, and like that's like sufficed him his entire career. And he's at Meta. So like that's kind of like the base that maybe you would need in like a UXR position. But yeah, so having like any kind of like formal stats training I think has made me like extremely valuable like on my team. And I would definitely recommend like learning a programming language if you don't know already, because I also think it's like good for your brain to be able to like think in that way.
All right, very last question, and then we'll set you free. Is it possible to get paid internships, or are all internships voluntary?
Oh no, there's so many paid internships, especially at the tech companies. Like you could make like twice, 3 times as much as you're making as a grad student, like doing a summer internship. Absolutely. Or like contract roles. Like I said, I'm a contractor now. But I also I have a friend who is currently finishing up his dissertation, and is working as a contract UXR at Meta Reality Labs we are on different teams, but so that's an option as well. And I know like a couple people who have done that, like in their last year of their PhD, they're like simultaneously writing their dissertation, but also like working full time as a contractor. So that's also an option because, you're paid nothing as a grad student and they're getting paid like so much more to like do that. So that's also like another option as well. Like contract work is easier to get, and doesn't require as much experience. In many ways, I'm being treated like a full-time employee, so I wouldn't say that's like easier work necessarily, but it is easier to get those roles as your first role for sure.
And are those roles typically in person, or can they be hybrid or remote?
Yeah, it's all kinds. Yeah, I think like at Meta, the policy now is you either have to be like, and I don't know if they like enforce this. You're either like remote as a contractor or you are on site. There's no like hybrid necessarily. But they haven't like enforced this yet. So sometimes I work at home. I usually go to the office because I get free food like every day, which I didn't appreciate about tech and I didn't think I would like, but I'm like, oh my gosh, I was a grad student. I love free food. It's great. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm sure I'm not going to be the only person who's like going right to LinkedIn after this to do job searches. So we're so grateful for you spending time and talking to us. And again, like, please reach out to Ashley if you have more questions or, if you want to connect. And thank you so much.
Yes. No, thanks for inviting me. Yeah, this has been fun.